Hi, welcome to The Farmer's Daughter. I'm Evelyn Golden, your farmer's daughter. I'm not a horticulturist nor a master gardener, but being a farmer's daughter, I have learned a thing or two over the years about gardening and a few things about homesteading. Today, we're not in the garden. Today, I wanted to take you on a journey with me back to Kansas. Back in July, I went to Kansas to visit family and friends with my two sons, Owen and Cameron. And while we were there, we had many, many adventures. We are doing part 2 of our trip because we were there for nearly 7 days and we did a lot. We were on the go. So on about Tuesday, we had a family function to attend and we were so excited to finally get to see family and friends and neighbors that we hadn't seen in years. The last time I was in Kansas was in 2013. And this is being taped in 2021. So we were really excited to get to see our friends and family. So we saw numerous friends, cousins, aunt and uncles. Now I am one of 30 grandchildren on both sides of my family. So out of the 25 cousins I have, only 9 of them were able to make it to the event, but it was great to see them all. So the next day, after our family event, we decided to go back to Ellsworth from where we were staying in Lincoln and tour historic Ellsworth. Now, I've shared with you before that Ellsworth is an old cow town. It was part of, it was a stop on the Chisholm Trail. So we're going to start at the museums in town. And we start with this sign welcoming us to Ellsworth, letting you know that it is the wickedest friendly town. So the history of Ellsworth is rich in, from the Chisholm Trail, the cow towns, as well as numerous generals post-Civil War had happened. So as we arrive into town, we come across this marker. And the marker reads, when the Union Pacific built through here in 1867, this was buffalo country. As the engines chugged on west, the Hayes newspaper recorded the passengers on the cars between here and Ellsworth have almost daily fine sport shooting at buffalo. Immense herds of huge beasts constantly entering for races with the locomotives. Ellsworth, founded in 1867, was a main terminus of the Texas cattle trade in Kansas from 1871 to 1875. As such, it was one of the wildest of the cow towns. There were fabled shootings and even a fabled tour down Main Street by one of the dance hall girls in costume of Lady Godiva. South of Ellsworth was the Mother Bickerdike home for old soldiers and their families. Named for Mary Bickerdike from a famed Civil War nurse and social worker, Fort Ellsworth was established 4 miles southeast of this marker in 1864. 2 years later, it was renamed Fort Harker, and in 1867 was moved northeast to present-day Kannapolis, where 4 of its stone buildings may be seen today. Here is where General Sheridan planned the Winter Indian Campaign of 1868 and 1869. Other famous generals included Grant, Sherman, Hancock, Miles, and Custer. They all visited and were quartered in Fort Harker. The post was abandoned in 1873. So this just gives us a little sampling of how important and how much influence my little old town of Ellsworth had on the development of the Wild West. So once we read this sign and we kind of looked around, that we decided to go in and tour the Hodgins House Museum Complex. Now, when I was growing up, it was just the Hodgins House, the church, the school, and the livery. So they've added a lot of great things over the time. So when we walked in to purchase our tickets to tour, I was so surprised that an old school friend named Tracy, who my sister had actually gone to school with, was working in the museum, and she became our tour guide. So we started off in the house. And the Hodgins family, I'm not sure when they lived in Ellsworth, but they were a predominant family, and their house was later turned into this museum. So as we walk in the front door, we see a formal sitting room. And then as we walk through a small office past the dining room, we went into the large kitchen, and we got to see this magnificent, beautiful, large cast iron blue stove. What I wouldn't give to still cook on a stove like that today. And then over in the corner showed a couple of high chairs, which actually resembled a high chair that I sat in growing up, that my grandmother sat in back in 1903 through 1905 when she was a little girl. So I'm guessing that these high chairs are probably around that same time period. And then we saw the old-fashioned cupboard, keeping all the supplies that they would need to cook. So as we left the kitchen, we went through another small sitting room where we saw another desk and some newspaper articles. And then we went up the stairs through this rather grand staircase. And up at the top of the stairs, we saw numerous bedrooms, were decorated with quilts and whatnot to represent the day. There were dressing rooms and a hallway filled with old newspaper clippings and photos. I found these 3 photos of Ellsworth ranging back from the 1880s, probably into the early 1900s. And I just thought they were fascinating to show how the town has changed over the years. So after we left the house, we went over to the livery. And this was one of my famous places to visit as a child, because this is where we held some of the town held some of the things that my family had donated over the years. So we found a few little goodies of some pictures of some great uncles, but the thing that I was most excited to find that I didn't realize that had been added to the museum was my great Uncle Leo Kepke's old barber chair was on display. I remember going into his barber shop and walking through the back and visiting my great Aunt Betty, who was working for the ladies and cutting their hair. So it was pretty exciting to get to see that chair on display. So we went looking for my family's branding iron, and we didn't find it, but I was assured by Tracy that it was still in the museum. So we kept looking. So after we left the livery, we looked out onto the museum grounds and saw the old terracotta train station depot. So we went over and saw that. We visited the old church, the old schoolhouse, and took a look at the wonderful old caboose that had come through on the railway. And at the end of the tour, we stopped in at the newest area. So as we toured the newest edition of the museum complex, in there we found some old buffalo skin chaps, and we finally found my family's brand. It had originally belonged to my father's uncle, Jack Harmon. So if you see in the design, it actually resembles a J and an H. And he later, when my father purchased the farm, he got the brand. Now the purpose of a branding iron is to mark your cattle, whether they are sold, lost, or forbidden, stolen. Cattle thieves were quite popular back then. This branding iron would actually mark the cattle so they could know where they are within the market and who they belong to, or if a herd of cattle have been reported stolen, they could take them. So as we were touring the newest edition, we came across this old Perry Sooner and a general store. So I took a video in the general store, so let's go over to that. Today we are touring historical Ellsworth. We are at the Ellsworth County Historical Museum. It's called the Hodgins House, and we are in the newest part of the museum that they did a replica of a general store that would have been where all of the settlers, townspeople would have gone in to get their goods, whether they were coming to town or whether they lived in town. It's very fascinating. While we were here earlier, we also found
my family's branding iron, which would have been used to actually brand the cattle. This was before ear tags came into existence. So if your cattle, for whatever reason, escaped or got out, or they went to market, you could identify who was their owner. So you could get it back to back home if they did escape. So let's take a quick look around.
So we have a segment here from the old post office where somebody would have come in to post a letter. And then we get into the general mercantile and any goods they would have had to purchase. It would have been a large one room. So we would have had the little belly stove, and often there was a table with possibly a checkers game where farmers or folks from outside the skirt of town would have come in to visit and catch up on gossip and anything else happening around town. Here we have some items donated from the old Ellsworth County Hospital. Behind is a large, beautiful American flag. So we have some of the cabinets, an old doctor's box, which looks like had some type of a breathing apparatus, an old scale, and many tools and instruments that they would have used to treat their patients. Here's another old cabinet. A scale to weigh a baby when it was first born. Some lighting instruments. I'm not sure what type of things they would have done on that back table. An old wheelchair. Let me see if I can show you this old dentist chair from the Wild West. And we even have an old iron lung that was actually used to treat polio patients in the 1940s through the 1950s in Ellsworth Hospital. And then we go into just some looms, an old bowling scorekeeping from the old Coach and Four here in Ellsworth, an old tractor, various saws and saw blades, farming equipment, plowing equipment, threshing to carry ice, the brands in the way back, and a covered old Perry schooner without the cover, and another old wagon. So after we finished touring the rest of the museum, we had made plans to head over to Kannapolis to tour Fort Harker. And on our way to Fort Harker, we had stopped at the original town site of Ellsworth, where it showed that the town had existed but was destroyed in floods in 1867. So they ended up moving the town a little bit further north and a little bit further west to help prevent for future flooding. So, and sadly, this is where we had to say goodbye to my niece Tara and her adorable children, who were able to spend the entire afternoon with us as we toured the museum. They had to head home, and we headed off to Kannapolis to tour Fort Harker. So after we visited Fort Harker, we took a short break, and then we headed to the western part of Ellsworth County to a place called Scorched Stone Farm. They had graciously invited us to tour their Wagyu beef operation and their cut flower gardens. So when we arrived at Scorched Stone Farms, I was surprised to find out that this was actually not far from where I grew up, probably about 5 to 6 miles. So that was kind of exciting to be at a different part of the county that I had never actually been before, but realizing that it was pretty close to home. So as we arrived into Scorched Stone, we were greeted by their dogs, very, very friendly, and we met with Josh. Hi, today, as you know, as the farmer's daughter, we have been exploring Ellsworth County. No place like homecoming. So today we are west of Ellsworth, just outside of a little town called Holyrood. And we have been invited by Kansas Hospitality, by Scorched Stone Farm. And we have here the farmer, Josh.
Yeah.
He's going to tell us a little bit about what goes on here at Scorched Stone. So Josh, why Scorched Stone?
Well, there's a couple fires. 1931, the barn burned down, and if you look at the stone, which I think you're going to take a picture of it actually, you can see the red where it actually burnt. And then a few years ago we had another fire, and we have a little shop that burnt down, and that when limestone gets heated it turns red, which it really isn't good for the limestone. But,
I can imagine not.
But it's pretty tough stone, and it lasts, because that barn was built in 1900 and then burned down in 1931. They redid it and all that.
And here still today in 2021.
Yeah, so that's where the name came from.
So what do you do here on the farm at Scorched Stone?
Well, my wife and I moved back in 2017, and actually my mom and dad have been here since I was a kid, and we moved back just to help a little bit more. And Jess and I did a little research into commodity ag with wheat and milo and those corn, those crops. It isn't in cattle. It traditionally, in the traditional sense, isn't necessarily a big time money maker.
I remember that. I grew up on a conventional farm, and we went under.
Yeah, and that's become a lot more common now. Even when I moved back here, and I can imagine you coming back, there's a lot less people.
Yes, there is.
There's whole communities drying up, and a lot of it has to do with wealth being sucked out by industrial ag. So
nobody supports the local farmer anymore. So farmer's daughter can teach you anything. Buy local and support your local farmer.
And that's exactly what we try to do. We're everything we do is farm to table, farm to vase. My wife and my mom, they have cut flowers, which we're actually starting to sell. They do weddings and things with them, but they also sell to our local florists in Ellsworth, the petal place, and we're trying to branch out maybe to Elmwood and Grape Bend with some of that as we get larger. I mean, it's taken us 4 or 5 years to figure out how to grow flowers.
It does not happen overnight.
Yeah, I mean, this is the first year we've had bells of Ireland actually get tall enough where you use them. So, I mean, that would be a great flower for your guys' region.
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
We do grow that a lot.
I was going to say that would be a good flower. Here, it's a little tougher. And then the Wagyu beef, doing your research, you see the meat industry is owned by 85%. 85% of it's owned by 4 packers. So that's another way wealth's being sucked out of these communities. Just traditional ag, selling at the sell barn. They're not getting the prices they need to even break even sometimes. And so we did research on a breed called Wagyu cattle that's high marbling. They're really docile, but it's called Kobe beef, and Kobe's actually a region of Japan. So this is they call it American Kobe.
Correct.
And most of the stuff you get in restaurants, half Wagyu, half Angus. Our cows are mostly half Wagyu cows and Angus cows, and then we have full blood bulls, so we get 3/4 blood. Here, so you're getting a little higher quality.
Okay.
Things like that, and we've kind of grown. We have our own registered Angus from Green Garden Angus that we bought locally here, that we're going to be able to get our own replacements. And then we have one full-blood Wagyu cow that we just bought that we've actually done embryos and things like that, so we can start supplying our own bulls.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so it'll be a one-stop.
And then supplying your own bulls, would that be supplying your own bulls for yourself,
Yes.
and then outsourcing
for
to other farms,
ourselves,
maybe?
and then outsourcing, hopefully, to where people come to buy from us and for their genetics also, but mostly we're meat right now. I mean, we had 13 processes here.
I got some friends here.
Yeah, and then we're gonna have 17 next year. But we're constantly feeding out steers through the year.
Fantastic. Now, I know that you're saying how conventional farming is going down and you had to do your research if you were going to do this. Another thing that I know that happened even 30, 40 years ago when I was growing up here, and it's still happening today, probably even to a larger degree, that farmers don't just farm.
No.
You can't earn a living strictly as a farmer anymore.
No,
so can you tell us a little bit about what you do besides farming?
I'm a teacher. I coach high school football. Before that, I college football for 15 years. My wife was in the directors of missions. And then we moved back in 17. And my wife actually does leadership training for the KDFC, Kansas Department of Corrections. My dad works for their Kansas Department of Corrections. And then my mom was a teacher in middle school, so we all have full-time jobs.
And the job of running a farm is a full-time job within itself.
We're learning that, and we got more irons in the fire. And we feel like we're doing something that is beneficial overall, though. So we feel good about it. It's a lot of work, but it's getting a little more streamlined. We're getting better at it.
Well, we appreciate all the hard work that you do, and as I tell everybody, some of the hardest working people in America are farmers. And if you ate today and you plan to eat tomorrow, it's because of a farmer. So remember that. So Josh and his wife Jess are going to show us a little bit around the farm and take a look at a few things up close. Come join us. Lots of jalapenos, bell pepper, squash, watermelon. I think they have zucchini, cucumbers.
So we're in Jess in the cut flower garden right now, and she's been showing us around all the different flowers and even telling us how she has to harvest a flower to get it to your local florist. So Jess, we're at by the sunflowers.
Yeah.
So tell me about how you would harvest a sunflower.
So most of the time what you can do, we plant ours very close together, about 6 inches. And reason being, if you plant them further apart, that means their heads are going to get a lot bigger. Then they're floppier. They're really great for the birds, but not so much for cut flowers. So some great times to cut these flowers are right when the petals are starting to, just barely starting to come out. And it's really quite simple. We actually don't cut them first. We peel all of the leaves off, except for that top leaf, because they'll suck all the nutrients and the water out. So we peel all those off and then cut it off the stem too and put those in our cooler. So a lot of times people come out to a flower farm and they think, oh, we're going to have a boatload of flowers, but not necessarily the case, because a lot of flowers you have to cut, I guess, prematurely or early before those blooms are fully out, so that way you get the longest vase life.
Okay, it's so interesting, because you would think that you just go out and, like you're in a meadow, and cut, snip, beauty.
Some are that way, but the yarrow, we have status, some of those you have to cut when they're fully bloomed, but a good portion of cut flowers you have to cut early.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let's go check out the rest of the garden.
So we're leaving the farm and we're heading up to the greenhouse. My son Cameron is my chauffeur, and my son Owen is in the side-by-side ahead of us with Jess. We'll see you when we get there. Those bells of Ireland, those usually get a few feet tall, but again, they're cool flowers. So
Once it starts getting hot, these are all gonna die.
Okay.
Once it gets even more hot, I should say.
These are very popular in the Northeast. Every step forward I take, she takes one step back. Or rather, he takes one step back. So as you can see, we had such fun at Scorched Stone Farm. I just loved it there. I could have stayed there forever. I would like to thank Josh and Jess, say that fast 10 times, Homoka, for their wonderful hospitality and sharing a little slice of Ellsworth County with us so we could learn more about what Scorched Stone Farm is all about. So if you are interested in what they do about Scorched Stone Farms, you can also visit them at www.scorchedsstonefarm.com and see a little bit more about Josh and Jess's operation. So after Scorched Stone Farm, we headed east back to Canopolis area. I know you're thinking we just came from there, but this was the way that things were timed and planned. So we met up with one of my childhood friends and a fellow farmer's daughter, Melissa. Melissa and her family lived on a farm just a few miles away from us as we were growing up. And now her and her husband Randy live in another part of the county just outside of Canopolis, and she agreed to take us for an adventure to Ferris Caves and the part of the Smoky Hill River Valley area near her home. So it took us a little drive to find the Ferris Caves. If you ever venture out to Ellsworth and end up in that area to do some sightseeing, I really recommend taking the extra effort to find Ferris Caves. So we went through these winding roads and we came upon the caves, and as we were touring them, we discovered that they were 3 caves that are about 12 feet square with about 10-foot arch ceilings. And these caves were carved into this Dakota sandstone cliff using only a pickaxe by a Coloradan miner named Charles Giffey in probably the late 1880s. And he lived on this land and in the caves up until the time that he sold them in 1893 to a Winifred and William Ferris. So there they lived, and that's where the caves got their name. So the Ferris, they lived in the caves for a short time until they built a house nearby. But after that, they still used the caves. The caves were used for storage, a spring house, for a generator room, and even for a short time, it was used for a schoolhouse for even other children in the area. So as we were touring the caves, we actually saw this fresh stream of spring water that was flowing through one of the caves. And Melissa was telling us that this was how they kept their food cool in the summer, and they used it for fresh, cooling water. So in a way, it was kind of like one of the first refrigeration systems of the prairie. So here is the top of the cliff out here. Now this land is also, this is a state park. It's also government owned. So whenever the lake gets flooded due to high or heavy rains out here, all of these caves will be underwater. We had a pretty decent amount of rain last night with a little bit of a thunderstorm. So that is why things are flooded again. So we can't get in the caves. But I just wanted you to see this. Can you hear the locusts off in the background? And there's my old neighbor and boys there exploring. But this is in the basin of the Smoky Hill River, which is what Ellsworth is built on to have their settlement. And oh, that's a lightning bug there flying in on my screen. I don't know if you got to see him. But this is just beautiful. This video is not doing this justice, folks. If you want to see this in person, you're just going to have to get a plane ticket and come on down to Kannapolis, Kansas and check it out. So we're out here at Ferris Caves, just outside of Kannapolis, actually near Kannapolis Lake. Ferris Caves is built into the side of this large sandstone. Is it sandstone or limestone? I think it's sandstone. So Mr. Ferris, I don't know that much about him. I will learn some more and fill you guys in later. He carved this entire cave out. And there's a walkway through here, but that part is flooded, so you guys can't see it. But this is where he lived, summer, winter, for many, many years. So we are inside the other cave now. Melissa is a true adventurer. If you listen carefully, you can hear the coyotes in the distance. So after our trip to the Ferris Caves, we called it in for the night and we headed back to Lincoln. So the next morning we woke up and we were on the run again. And my cousin Cindy, who was gracious enough to take us for a tour of a little town called Denmark, Kansas. We are outside of Denmark, Kansas. We are headed to the other side of my heritage, where on my mother's side, all of my ancestors from Denmark settled. Now, Denmark is a special place in my heart because on my mother's side of the family, we are predominantly of Danish heritage. And my great-grandparents ran a little store, a little grocery store in Denmark, Kansas back then. And my grandfather and his sister grew up in the rooms in the back of the store. So all that really remains in Denmark today are a few buildings and the famed Danish Lutheran Church. I tried to find the census records on Denmark today, but there were none. That the town is so small and has such a small population that they haven't even bothered to do a census. So that'll tell you. Denmark is just outside of Lincoln. Lincoln is where we stayed, and Lincoln is the county seat of Lincoln County. And Lincoln itself, being the county seat, is only have a population of maybe 1,100 people. So that's the booming town of that county, to kind of give you an idea of how small these towns are. So as we were touring Denmark, Cindy let us know that a group of people have put together a Denmark Restoration Committee, and they have been restoring some of the old buildings. And one of the buildings they're restoring are the Anderson buildings, which are where my grandparents, the Andreassens, grocery store was actually. And as we were touring, we came across this old abandoned bank, and we had such a good time even going inside and touring the ruins and seeing that the safe was still there and peeking in. It was too dark, we couldn't see anything. So after we left the bank, we went over to see the church. The church was actually built in 1878, and in 1991 it was added to the National Registers of Historic Places. So as you can see, the building is made of the famed limestone. So a lot of buildings in the area are made of limestone. When the settlers and the early pioneers were settling here, there wasn't a lot of lumber. So they had to use what resources they had. So that's where you're going to see a lot of buildings with either that sandstone or that limestone finish. So when we left Denmark, we headed back to Lincoln, where we were staying with my cousin Cindy, and we looked around a few things that Lincoln had to offer. Now, my oldest son had discovered that there was a famous tombstone of the traveling salesman in one of the Lincoln cemeteries. So we found this, and it actually is a little tombstone of a traveling suitcase. And the story goes that this 42-year-old businessman named James Jacob died in 1891. And according to the inscription on the limestone suitcase, here is where he stopped last. So the legend says that he was traveling and he had no family and he suddenly died, only leaving his samples of in his satchel behind. So a local stone carver actually modeled his tombstone after the case that he had been carrying. Later years, they discovered that Jacobs was actually a local, and for whatever reason, nobody spoke up. So the townspeople came forward and paid for his tombstone, and he still has that famed today. So after we left Lincoln, we headed to Hutchinson, where we were earlier that week visiting the salt mine cave. So as we headed on our way to Hutchinson, we made one pit stop to tour my old ancestral farm where I grew up. So we have the 8 miles of dirt roads traveling off the highway to my old farm. We are outside of Denmark, Kansas. We are headed to the other side of my heritage, where on my mother's side, all of my ancestors from Denmark settled. So we are on 14th Road, which is off of Avenue Q, which is off of Kansas Highway 14. This is the road to the farm, and this pasture here that has the family brand, signifying that it was family land. This pasture was where we would go fishing, we would go swimming, and then if you look way far in the horizon, about 10, maybe 9 miles away, is the Ellsworth grain elevator and the road to town. And that's the road to the farm. That's where we're headed now. Pasture behind where our barn was, where my sister and I would play for hours at a time. So you could say this was my playground. I had not been back to the old farm since 2013, and it had been abandoned in 2008. So it really had changed. It was a bittersweet moment. It is overgrown. The barn was not even visible, and the views that I grew up with were now overgrown with trees. It really is amazing how fast Mother Nature can take over. So the house is falling apart and succumbing to the elements, but it will always have a special place for me because it's where my great grandfather first settled, and my grandmother and my father and myself all grew up. And I'm glad that I had a chance to share those special moments with my two sons. So we dried our eyes and we set off to Hutchinson, where I wanted to visit my 89-year-old aunt. My Aunt Loopy is just an amazing woman, and she's such an inspiration. And I'm so glad that we had a chance to see her before we left Kansas. So it was a short and sweet visit, much like my Aunt Loopy. But we headed back to Canopolis then. It was another hour-and-a-half drive where we met up. That's my rooster, Marty. Hi, Marty. So as we left Hutchinson, we headed back to Canopolis where we were going to meet up with Melissa again. My friend Melissa had arranged with her husband Randy for us to get a chance to see a harvest. Now, harvest had been going on the entire week that we were there. It was going to be the last field that Randy was harvesting, so we got back to Canopolis as fast as we can. And unfortunately, when we arrived in the field, he was already finished cutting, but we got there just in time for the unloading of the 900 bushels of wheat grain going from the combines into the tractor trailer semi that was going to take the grain to a local elevator to where it would be stored until it was sold. So, but Melissa, being the amazing friend that she is, suspected that we were a little disappointed that we didn't get a chance to have my boys ride on the combines. So we quickly packed up and we set off to try to find some neighbors who might still be harvesting. And we were very lucky that we came across the Kubrick family, who were still finishing up their last field. And when we arrived, first no one was in sight. So we arrived into the field and all we saw were the two combines, a tractor with a second wagon, and a tractor trailer, camper. So they had actually stopped for a break and were having dinner. So during harvest season, it's all hands on deck from the start to the finish, because you don't know if Mother Nature is going to throw something at you like a thunderstorm, a hailstorm, or even just rain, that you need to get the harvest in. So often we will pack up food and take it to the harvest crew. Sometimes they will actually take a break and go to the food. So we were lucky that we found them while they were on their dinner break, and they graciously allowed my sons Owen and Cameron to ride shotgun on the combines. Now, we were a little surprised, rather Owen and Cameron were a little surprised when we found out that the combine operators were two brothers named Thad and Owen Donley, who were 16 and 14 years old. So both of these boys were younger than my sons, but yet they were going to be driving these giant pieces of equipment called a combine, putting in this harvest. So as I was explaining to my sons, this was their summer job. That is not uncommon for teens to be working on the farm or even helping out neighbors as a summer job. So we would like to thank Jake Kubrick and Thad and Owen for their hospitality and letting Owen and Cameron have that amazing once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for two boys in suburban Massachusetts to ride on a combine. So this was the last stop on our trip. We dusted off the dust from the fields and we headed back to Lincoln so we could pack and get a good night's sleep, because we had a 2.5-hour drive ahead of us the next morning back to Wichita, where we were going to catch our flight back to Boston. And once we got home, yes, I slept a very long time.